My name is Brittany Mojica, and this is my Mealworm Inquiry Project. In this project, I did 3 humane experiments with my mealworms. These experiments did not cost me anything. Most of the materials that I used, I already had at home. The only thing I had to buy were the mealworms. I bought them at a Petco, which were not expensive at all. They cost me around $2. Let's begin. In this slide, I have the table of contents. I have the experiments that I did, the materials that I used, and the photographs. For my first experiment I did, do the mealworms prefer the wet napkin or the dry? My hypothesis was that I believe that the mealworms will prefer the dry area over the wet. In this slide, we have the materials that I used for my first experiment, which were a wet paper towel, a dry paper towel, styrofoam plate, and the mealworms. Here I have some of the photographs for my first experiment. I first tear the napkin in half. I wet one of the napkins while leaving the other one dry. I placed them in the styrofoam plate. I carefully placed a couple of worms in both sides. When I placed them, the ones on the dry area were really active while the ones in the dry were not. Over my observation time, I noticed that the mealworms prefer the dry area over the wet. When I came back to check up on them a few days later, I noticed that most of the mealworms were on the dry side. Here concluded that my hypothesis for this experiment was correct. They prefer the dry area over the wet. For my second experiment, I did, do the mealworms prefer the light or the dark? My hypothesis was that I believe that the mealworms will prefer the dark over the light. Here we have the materials that I used for this experiment. I used a cutout of an egg carton to create the little shaded area for the mealworms. I used a styrofoam plate and mealworms. Here are some of the photographs for my second experiment. The first thing that I did was that I scattered the worms on the plate. The thing that's used to create the shade was cut out of egg cartons. I placed it where there were no worms. What I first observed was that the worms would be around the carton but would not go in. I left it for a few days, and when I came back, most of the worms were under the carton, meaning that they went to the darker area. To truly see if my hypothesis was right, I moved the carton to the other side where there were no worms, and I left it for another few days. When I came back, I noticed that the worms were once again under the carton, proving that my hypothesis for this experiment was also correct. Another thing that from this experiment is that I got a beetle. I didn't think that any of my worms would turn into a beetle, but in this experiment it did. For my last experiment, I did what would the mealworms prefer to eat. I had bananas, apples, and strawberries. My hypothesis for this experiment is that I believe that the mealworms will prefer the bananas and apples. Here I have the materials that I used for my last experiment. I had bananas, apples, strawberries, styrofoam plate, and the mealworms. Here are some photographs of my last experiment. The first thing that I did was to place the worms in the middle. After that, I cut out the fruit and I carefully placed it around them. The first thing that I noticed was that the mealworms stayed in the middle. But a couple minutes passed and I seen that some of them started to move towards the bananas and apples. And then a few moments later, I saw a couple of them go towards the strawberries. Then later, they started to move towards the bananas and left the strawberries. I left them for a few days, and honestly, when I came back, the fruits were already moldy. I forgot to take a picture, but when I saw it, most of the worms were at the bananas. concluding that my hypothesis was somewhat correct, but also wrong, because most of the worms ended up at the bananas instead of the apples and the strawberries. And this concludes my mealworm inquiry project. Thank you.